Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversation is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepal. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting contemporary Nepali society. The theme for Nepal Conversations' second season is gender. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of gender and sexuality and what it means for Nepal. Our guest today is Stirr.
Stirr is an associate professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii Manoa and the director of the Center for South Asian Studies. She is the author of Singing Across Divides, Music and Intimate Politics in Nepal, which won the 2019 Cohn Prize for first books on South Asia from the Association for Asian Studies. She has a BA in Music and Religious Studies from Lawrence University in Wisconsin and an MA, MPhil, and PhD in ethnomusicology from Columbia University. She has also taught at the University of Oxford, Leiden University, and the New School. Her research focuses on music, dance, language, intimacy, and politics in South Asia, especially in Nepal and the Himalayan region. She also performs Nepali folk music as a singer, flutist, and percussionist.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Anna, and thank you so much for joining us. You have been studying music and the performance arts in Nepal and South Asia from an anthropological point of view, and your research gives us new ways to understand gender and sexuality. Could you tell us a bit more about the relationship between performance arts and gender and sexuality, and what got you interested in this field of work?
Sure. I think the relationship between the performing arts and gender and sexuality is a really big one. And I actually teach a class that's called Gender and Asian Performing Arts for grad students here at University of Hawaii. So it's a huge topic, and I'll try and keep my answer brief here. Basically, the performing arts are so interesting because they allow you to adopt a new persona. Especially in theater and dance, you can adopt a new persona with your body, and in music, you can adopt a new persona with your body and your voice, especially in song. So you can try on different forms of gender expression through the performance arts. And also you can try on different forms of gender expression that are associated with different sexualities, which of course differ from culture to culture and even within the same culture. So it's a huge topic. And then what got me interested in studying song in Nepal and music and gender and sexuality, especially in song, was first I am a gendered person in the world and have had many experiences as a woman that made me want to go deeper into relationships with into how this is dealt with in the performing arts, because the performing arts are a public space for expressing things that are often considered to be in what some people might call the private sphere, or also things that are inappropriate in other situations. So they offer that space, and you can do more in the performing arts within that performance frame than you might be able to in other genres of expression. So that's one of the things that got me into it. Plus, I've always been interested in singing and playing instruments ever since I was a child. So I was always interested in performing arts as a field of work. And what got me into Dori especially was, first of all, a sort of dry academic interest in music and language and their relationship. Friends of mine introduced me to Lokdori in live performance. I had heard it already in recordings, but I hadn't paid all that much attention to those recordings. But then when I went to hear Dori performed live at a Dori restaurant, and I think there was a festival going on that was the Rani Pokori Festival. So every day at Rani Pokori, there was rafting in the Pokori, and along the side there was Dori. And so I went every day and learned more and more about it. And I took different friends who were not from the culture of Dori, and I got their thoughts on it, and it just seems so fascinating that so many different aspects of Nepali culture and what was changing in Nepal at the time were coming together in Logdori performance. So that's what got me hooked.
That is fascinating, and we'd like to talk more about that. Your book, Singing Across Divides, which won the Bernard S. Cohn Book Prize for the first books on South Asia in 2019, talks about cultural intimacy and public intimacy. What do these concepts mean, and what might this add to the long-standing feminist critiques of the public-private dichotomy? But also, what might a closer look at intimacy reveal about multicultural identity politics or nationalism or conflict in Nepal?
Okay, these are a lot of things, and I think I'm going to start with your question about feminist critiques of the public-private dichotomy. So where that dichotomy is often referred to, at least in Euro-American scholarly circles, is philosopher Jürgen Habermas's idea of the public sphere, which is opposed to the private sphere. And the public sphere is the world of public discourse. And then the private sphere is the world of the home. So the private sphere is feminized and the public sphere is more masculinized. And so many things that have to do with home life, the life of the home, the life of the hearth, the life of intimate relations are put into the private sphere. The feminist critique of that can be summed up, the long-standing feminist critique can be summed up with the phrase, the personal is political. So that assertion, as we all know, is that even this private sphere, which Habermas brackets off from public conversations of politics, is shot through and always affected by politics itself. And at the same time, it affects public discourse and politics too. So they're not actually separate. And what intimacy as a concept does is allow us to talk about those things which in the Euro-American discourse of public and private are often put into the private sphere, but not without relegating those things to that dichotomy. The concepts that I use in my book, cultural intimacy and public intimacy, along with a couple of others, they try and give a greater analytical purchase to this idea of intimacy. And maybe I should also start by saying intimacy in my analysis in this book is also closest to the Nepali meaning of ghanistata. So it's closeness at the level that that closeness affects all involved parties. So cultural intimacy, this concept is a concept that was popularized by the anthropologist Michael Hertzfeld. And he is talking about cultural intimacy as the things that are felt to be inner and maybe a bit hidden and a bit embarrassing when brought into the public eye, especially when, especially related to a nation state or an ethnic group. And his example, because he is writing about Greece, is the idea that Greeks break plates when they are excited about things. So that's something that is perhaps a stereotype and a bit embarrassing about Greek people, but then at the same time, he says Greek people actually identify with that and like it, but inside their group. So cultural intimacy, as applied to Logdori, has to do with the way that it's valued within the nation state of Nepal. So it is seen as something that can be transgressive and has the possibility to trouble the social order, because from Logdori, as you may know, it stems originally from courtship practices, and people could potentially fall in love, run away and get married outside of the social norms that bring prestige and honor to their families. And they could also do so across lines of caste and class. There's this troubling of the social order that could be embarrassing to dominant social norms associated with national identity, but it's also something that's beloved. So that's the cultural intimacy side. And cultural intimacy as a concept has been criticized because of its focus on the nation state and because of its focus on what's supposedly inner or hidden. And public intimacy is a concept that was popularized by Levin Soysal, who is also, I believe, an anthropologist. I'm not quite sure of her disciplinary training. She might be more of a cultural studies person. But anyway, she's the one who popularized this phrase as a converse or an opposite of cultural intimacy. And this also applies to Dohuri, because Dohuri is not hidden. Dohuri is not only the gatherings of people who might run away into the woods to have their song fest outside of prying eyes. It's also promoted by the state at Lok Dohuri competitions since the 1980s. And it's, of course, a huge part of the commercial music industry. So those intimacies that might be transgressive are foregrounded in a very, very public medium. And then not only is it there in the recording industry, but people use those recordings for their own publicly intimate means. So I don't talk about this in the book because at the time there was no TikTok, but Lok Dohuri TikTok videos are a form of public intimacy. So we've spoken a bit here about what that might reveal about multicultural identity politics, nationalism, or conflict. And the major concept here is that Lok Dohuri at the intimate level always has the potential to be political because it has the potential to trouble the social order.
I was curious about this point you've been repeating about troubling the social order. And you talked about bridging the caste and class divides when we're performing the Dohuri, for instance. Did you find any instances of performers crossing the lines of gender and sexuality when they're performing Dohuri or any other art forms that you talk about in the book or in your work?
So crossing the lines of gender and sexuality, do you mean performing as a different gender or performing Dohuri that could be, say, a female-female flirtation?
I think it goes both ways. Whatever you might have come across would be very interesting to know more about.
Okay, in live Dohuri performance, I think people will take on not necessarily a different gender, and this is also in the mainstream Dohuri industry practice. Okay, so the real public intimacy that I wrote the book about. You don't really see people taking on a different gender per se, but you do see people taking on different gender expression. It's rarer in Lok Dohuri than it is for, say, in American country western music, for a woman to voice the inner thoughts of a man. Because in American country music, there's always a lot of songs that are presented as what in Nepali we would say is reikura. So something like what she said was, or what he said was. You preface the lyrics with that, and then you go on, I as a woman would sing the inner thoughts of a man, I would voice that. That's rare in Lok Dohuri. But what does happen is I could be performing a character who is a woman, but a very different kind of woman than myself, and acting in a way that I wouldn't normally act outside of the performance frame. So there is that kind of acting. And then the second one, as far as maybe some kinds of homosexual or non-heterosexual love, I would have to say that it does happen, but it doesn't necessarily happen it doesn't happen all that often, and it doesn't happen very much in the public eye. There is one video, which I did not think of this way while I was performing in it, but it has been read as a lesbian love story. And that's the video that I made with Komal Obi, which was, she planned it all. Chandrakala Shah wrote the lyrics. It was conceived as a video, as far as I know, about American and Nepali female friendship. But a lot of people read it as queer, and both Komaloli and I were very, very happy with that. But there are not many videos that are like that.
Thank you. We've been reading your book and we find it really, really fascinating. And in your book, you also talk about the Dohori music field as cosmopolitan and encompassed by transnational connections. And one often thinks of these ideas of cosmopolitanism and transnational domain as occupied by elites, but you also conceptualize these as in the context of non-elites. Why is it important to think about these ideas when we study gender and sexuality, and what does this approach teach us about sociocultural and political changes in Nepal and beyond?
I think I'll start with the concept of cosmopolitanism. The concept I use in the book is Pnina Werbner. She's an anthropologist. Her concept of vernacular cosmopolitanism. And yes, the term cosmopolitan is often associated with elites. And often on the left, instead of the term cosmopolitan, we might use international. But I'm not sure if Pnina Werbner was also thinking this way, but the way that I was thinking was that international in English emphasized the nation state too much. And it seemed like a relationship between nation states rather than the lived experiences of people. And so I found this concept of Pnina Werbner's where she talks about vernacular cosmopolitanism because I really wanted to talk about the experience of non-elites transnational movement and how that helped sort of conceptualize the space in which Lokdori performers imagine their worlds. So, for example, there's a strong connection to the history of Gurkha recruitment. And that too is rooted in a longer history of military labor migration in the subcontinent and its influence on the Viraha genre of songs, where usually it's a woman who's left behind and a man who has gone most often to be a soldier somewhere else. And so that love and longing for the absent lover that happens in those songs is part of a very, very long-standing South Asian tradition. But in Nepal, what are the trajectories of movement that shape what's expressed in the songs? That was a question that I was starting with. And so the context of non-elites and their movement, first of all, there's this international migration, which I'm talking about, and it's connected to internal migration. So with the quick growth of the Dori restaurants in the 2000s, especially in Kathmandu, but in other central cities like Narangat and Pokhara, it was people moving from rural areas to the cities and furthering the commercialization of Dori as a musical genre because there were lots of people who wanted to hear it. They wanted to recreate this sort of festival village environment in the places where they were in the cities. And then that created the demand for more and more performers to come and do it. And then also it spread to people who were not necessarily from those rural backgrounds. So this is one of the things that I talk about regarding ruralization of the city, where forms of social relations and, of course, forms of music and dance performance move from rural areas to urban areas and change the urban areas too. That's obviously going to have an impact on the social life of, say, the city here when we're looking at Kathmandu. And the way that politics play out there. It's more complicated, I think, in Nepal because where you vote is wherever you're registered for. So you actually, if you live in Kathmandu, you've got to go back to wherever you're from to cast your vote. Mm-hmm. And that's not true in every place in the world. In many places, you can become a resident of a city that you live in, and then you can cast your vote there. So around the world, beyond Nepal, population movements will change the political makeup of a city very strongly. along with changing the sociocultural aspects. And that can, at least in the United States, it's been something that has been very politically contentious and has led to a lot of political ugliness.
Thanks, Anna. Let's move on to one of your other publications, especially on Subisha and his theory of Nepali performing arts, where you show the broader applicability of Shah's methods for performance scholarship inside and outside Nepal. And you say it contributes to decolonizing ethnomusicology. Could you say who Subisha was and what his work might say about the innovative methods we could use in studying and learning from vernacular knowledge systems? If we could begin with, what do you mean by vernacular knowledge systems?
Okay, sure. Yeah, starting with vernacular knowledge systems are the ones that have not become globally or regionally dominant, but they're still quite prevalent. So when we talk about the vernacular for a language, it's a language that's perhaps not the dominant tongue in a particular region, but it's still extremely prevalent. So in South Asia, musical knowledge systems have been greatly influenced by two things. One is British colonization and their imposition of various knowledge systems and ideas of, for example, in music, what is classical and what is not classical. And then also, musical knowledge in South Asia has been highly influenced by the modernizing ideas of people at the turn of the 20th century in India, who created the Bhatkande Sargam notation system. Bhatkande is one of those people. Vishnu Bhatkande and Vishnu Paluskar were two musical theorists who were trying to standardize things all over South Asia. So Bhatkande made this notation system and everybody uses it now. And Subisha is somebody who spent his life performing in the Maruni tradition. He refers to it as the Pangdure music and dance tradition. And Pangdure, as far as I can tell in this context, means that they perform these dances primarily when the Pangdure millet was ripe. So at that time of the harvest in the year. So probably around Dasain Tihar. But they do perform it at other times of year as well. And this is a tradition that has many, many different parts. The dance dramas that are performed in it include Sorati, which is a story about a king and a queen and a baby who's floated away in the river and then comes back one day. And Krishna Charitra and other dance dramas. And then the kinds of music that are very, very popular throughout central Nepal and lots of surrounding areas like Jaure, Kyali, Churdka. And all of these are kinds of music, kinds of song, kinds of poetic meters, kinds of dances. So they all are integrated. So Subisha was so important because he documented all of this and he documented it in a holistic way. In South Asian music scholarship, there's often a lot of references to the Natya Sastra, which is an ancient text about drama and how it should be performed, about all the performing arts and how they should be performed. And that emphasizes their holism. But often when we perform and when we study, we don't emphasize this holism, but Subisha does. So why is attention to this decolonial? Well, a lot of colonial scholarship emphasized song texts as oral literature above and beyond anything else in performing arts, really to the expense of the performance context and how song was related to music, was related to dance, was related to drama. And Subisha says he doesn't even address these other people. He just says, well, this is how it is. So I think it's very, very important. And it's really just, I don't consider what our group here is doing in translating Subisha's works as very innovative. Really what I think we're doing is just something responsible. There's somebody who wrote in Nepali, he wrote a lot, Not all of it was published. We got the rights to translate it, and now we're doing it so people can see that this vernacular knowledge system about music that Subisha describes in great detail is a viable and useful way of understanding all of these musical forms that exist in Nepal. And it's really not necessary to apply methods from outside.
Thank you. As we were reading your work, we were also wondering about your research experience of working on gender and sexuality in Nepal. What are some of the difficulties of doing research on gender and sexuality, especially in relation to commercial music? And what are the challenges of researching and teaching this issue?
Mm. I think one thing to understand is there's not one commercial music scene. There are actually quite a few. So the answer to that question is going to be different regarding the Logdori scene or the Sugam Sangeet or Adunik Geet scene or the rock scene, the pop scene, the punk scene, etc. My own positionality would be different in any of those scenes. And so some of the difficulties of doing research that addresses gender and sexuality in the Lokdori scene is what I'll speak to right now. And some difficulties that I faced as a young woman were people's assumptions about what I was supposed to be doing, what I should be doing, what would what befitted me as a researcher, and what did not. Like one time I was performing in a Dori restaurant and a man who was in the audience came up to me and said, you know, you're doing a PhD. I don't like to see you here. This isn't right. You should be doing things that represent your mind and that don't foreground your body. Now, I thought that was really interesting because in comparison to a lot of other things, Lokdori performance, especially in Dori restaurants, doesn't foreground your body all that much. It's a lot about the words that you're saying. But this man's assumptions were that any woman who's performing on a stage is by definition foregrounding her body, and people who are doing PhDs should not also be doing that. So some people have this cognitive dissonance. And all of those kinds of experiences were learning experience for me about what kinds of views Nepali Dori singers were up against. Other things, like they all face sexual harassment from people with mindsets like this, and I did too. So I think that's not necessarily a difficulty of doing research on gender and sexuality. It's more a difficulty of being female in a patriarchal space that is trying to be a more egalitarian space. So there's pushback against the egalitarianism that exists here. Another thing about the actual research part, about getting to know things about people, is that people don't always want to open up. And my book relies on the many, many people who did trust me. And then what I write, also, I have to be very, very careful that I'm not doing anything that will hurt them. Even if they said, yes, write this, I have to ask them many, many times and read them the context and figure out, is it okay to tell these simple facts about you that might have bearing on your future? And you asked about the challenges of teaching gender and sexuality where I am in Hawaii, is that right?
Yes, yes.
I think the same challenges which exist all over the place apply in Hawaii as well, which is that sometimes when you introduce new things, you'll have rejection on the part of the students. So what am I trying to teach and what am I trying to get across is always a question that I ask myself. And how can I present it in a way that people will open up their understanding and become more accepting of difference? And honestly, there's kind of a self-selection among the people who take my classes. So they're already interested in this topic. It's not like a required topic. So they already really want to know. So in that case, that makes it a lot easier. But still, even among people who are very, very interested in learning more about varieties of gender and sexuality, they may still have some blocks toward understanding things that are very, very different from what may be a very wide range of things we already know. So you always, and even I in myself, come across places where I can learn. So that is a challenge, but it's also a major opportunity.
Thanks, Anna. What you were saying about the challenges of researching gender and sexuality in Nepal resonated with a lot with my own experiences of doing research there as well. But I picked up on one point that you were talking about earlier regarding sexual harassment of the Dohri, Lok Dohri singers, but also how we have been talking more about violence against researchers in the field, especially within anthropological research as well. There's a whole group called Me Too Anthro, and this especially has come to the fore since the Me Too movement. I wonder if you could say anything about that and whether the Me Too movement has brought about any changes regarding how universities are preparing researchers for these issues or providing support of any kind, or whether this has not really happened. What kind of conversations might be taking place if you know about them?
There are definitely a lot of conversations taking place about this. And here in the United States, I think it's going to be different in different countries with different policies. It's really been the academic associations, the professional associations that have taken it seriously and tried to create procedures for preparing people to address sexual harassment in the field, to address specifically ethnographic researchers. And the universities adopt these to varying degrees. A lot of it depends on interpersonal dynamics in a department, but it also depends on national policies. So in the United States, we have something called Title IX, which led to a lot of policies on campus about how to deal with and handle sexual assaults and harassment. And then during the Trump presidency, most of those were repealed and taken away. And now they've been brought back in some way, but I don't even know exactly how. But that's at the university institutional level. So at the level of preparing researchers, there are definitely a lot of mentoring conversations, much more so. It's more of a topic that's out in the open than it was 20 years ago, for sure.
Let's move on to your ongoing book project before we wrap up for today. Your recent book project is on love and revolution in Nepali progressive songs. Can you tell us something about that? It sounds exciting.
Thank you. I'm glad you think it sounds exciting. Yeah, this is an ongoing project, and like most projects, I never quite feel like I have enough, even though I've written a ton, and I'm still looking for a way that I can fit it all together into a book. But this book, I envisioned it first as kind of a response, a continuation of what I was doing with intimate politics in the book on Dori, because so many of the people who were also involved in progressive song were saying, well, there are so many love songs, but there's this dichotomy between progressive songs and love songs, and progressive songs are not love songs. And more than just saying the sort of old chestnut that love songs are just bourgeois, they would, to their credit, explain and say, it's not that we don't approve of love songs at all. It's just that we need to sing those other songs. And then once I started listening to a lot of them, I actually found that if you think of love as a very capacious emotion, there's a lot in there that is actually about love. It's just not about romantic love, and it's not in the viraha vein that so many of the Dori songs are. And it's also not necessary, it's not flirtatious. So it's more about love of your fellow human beings and creating a world in which everyone can be loved. If you think of it in that capacious way, the very broad concepts of love as love for humanity, or as some people reference, Vargya Prem or Vargya Maya, so class love, which is conceptualized as love among people who are of the same class. So it's a fellow feeling for people who have experienced life the same way as you. So I'm trying to look at all the different ways that that's expressed, but at the same time, I felt like I have to talk about emotionality more broadly, and I have to talk about these utopian ideas of what or how people are understanding what a better world might be. And I have to talk about the history of progressive song from the 1940s or so up to the present. So there's many, many things that I'm trying to fit into one book, and I'm not sure it'll work, but I have two articles coming out that focus on dance that come from this project. And neither of them are necessarily about love. One of them is about reality TV shows, and another one is about the history of Raktin Pariwar and its dance and how it's related to Chinese dance.
Thank you, Anna. We're now at the end of our conversation. And before we end, is there anything you would like to add or highlight as the key takeaway from your work?
I think a theme of my work up until this point has been the intersection of intimacy and politics, and this is a thread that unites it all. So that's what I'm going to keep doing in this Love and Revolution and Nepali progressive song history book. But as far as future trajectories go, I think gender and sexuality will always be a very, very important part of what I choose to research and what I focus on, because somehow I always find myself ending up there. So I'm very, very grateful for you allowing me to revisit the conceptual way that I was thinking about it when I was writing the Dori book, and just helping me think about the ways that I might apply these concepts in my other projects. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, for your time. It was really wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Anna. I have so many other questions as well. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you, both of you, Uma and Kumud. It's been wonderful to talk with you.